Hey, how you doing? Are you subscribed? No, like you are. It doesn't say that um on the picture right here. But hey, I'll tell you what else. You should subscribe because you can help me run my life by getting me to drink hot sauce if I get to 2,000 subscribers, which you should make me do. And I heard you guys like to watch me game. It's on this poll. I don't know. It's on this poll. So I mean, might as well throw it in there. Twitch is twitch.tv. I mean twitch.tv/Lotus Abbey, and yeah, let's get to it. I'll play every game, and hopefully you have fun watching any video that's about to play. So let's roll the clip. All right, and we're here for another video. This one is, did NATO really betray Russia? And yeah, let's get into it. It's about Alternate History Hub. So this is going to be a really good video. We haven't watched too much of them on this channel, so let's watch this one. And yeah, it's their newest video, and it's about the Russia-Ukraine situation. So let's get into it. And also, they have a donation thing on their page, so I'll always link the original video in the description down below. So we'll get, you guys will definitely have that link there, so that way you can go donate. I'll probably put the donation link in the description for this video too as well, so that way you can donate. They raised a lot of money so far though, so that's good. And yeah, let's get into it. Man.
How did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO? Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these two rivals after the end of the Cold War would have came together in peace? Because apparently Putin seems to think so, or at least he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't.
Yeah, I don't really think that happens, and I don't think that he's not I don't think he knows what truth is. He literally said he's not targeting like civilians' homes. He's targeting like political buildings, and I'm like, no, you're not. You literally have like punctured like civilians' homes. That's not possible.
The best, by the way.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
What do you mean?
The answer to why Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin. 100%. This was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad...
That's true. It's literally all Putin. I can't really see anything that would be different. So I definitely can't. It is all Putin. It's nobody else wanted a war except for him.
Things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion, even if NATO took over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now.
Right, it actually is even worse.
1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed. Or, well, George H.W. Bush agreed. Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never...
So yes, he agreed verbally, so it was a non-binding contract.
Written agreement. It was just an understanding. Oh, also I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement that doesn't matter. Throughout the last century, there have been multiple discussions between NATO and the Russians over their relationship with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east, into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant mention of the CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are dead. Bush, despite overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq, still promised to not raise taxes.
Read my lip.
And then he
raised taxes, like everyone does. You really that's something that's gonna happen regardless. It doesn't even matter which political party. They might say they're not gonna raise taxes. You have to. Taxes is something you actually have to raise, usually every year, because it depends on the president's spending or the government's spending.
Raise taxes. So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight, and yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button.
I love how you just keep saying, this does not justify Russia's actions against their neighbors.
I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states were living under Soviet control for decades.
And you know it's bad when a channel that is based on alternate history and what-if scenarios can't even bring itself to say, you know what, maybe what if this could happen? What if they could have been different in the U.S. and NATO could have came to peace, right? It's super funny to me to see that, and it's they're not even gonna bullshit you on that one.
As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO, or at least get some protection from the West in case anything happened again. Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is slowly rebuilding, with a few hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace. All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership for peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners.
But then why not join NATO, which would mean that you're okay and perfectly fine with everyone else in Europe? It doesn't seem like you're perfectly fine with everyone else in Europe.
Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined NATO. Yet this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong. But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame. That fear and paranoia only began to grow, and it became manifested when this...
Ah, that's a young Putin right there. That's a young Vladimir Putin. Have you guys ever heard a video of him talking, speaking English? I mean, I've seen it on JJ. I forgot his last name. I think it's I forgot how you say it, but I've heard it, and it's pretty interesting because he doesn't sound confident at all speaking English, and it's so funny. Even though he knows how to perfectly speak English, like he can speak English good. It's just that he doesn't sound confident.
This guy came to power. But even with Putin in office and him winning the presidency through some zany means.
If you want me to watch, I would say if you want me to watch it though, which isn't a hard thing to do, I can watch it. Just put in the comment section down below like that you want me to watch it out. That'll be a reaction that comes out.
Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US, yet that was going to change. In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push, brought in 7 new nations. Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to articles in 2004 where people say Russia is going to change their foreign policy. The Russian Duma began freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin.
Yeah, Putin. I mean, he was a part of, before he was the leader, of Russia. He was a special forces soldier for Russia. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense that he's super ready just to go to war. It really does make a lot of sense. He was, military itself is aggressive, but like special forces, you have to be hardcore to go through with it. And he doesn't really care what anybody else thinks, so he doesn't have that part where he's like, well, would this be good for the humans that would be in that area? He doesn't think like that, so he already doesn't have that part in his brain, I feel like, to actually think that. So yeah.
Georgia was invaded 4 years later. Keep in mind, when I say Russians, I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government.
Of course. I think that's what everybody knows, that for the most part, Russian citizens aren't on board with what's going on in in Ukraine. They're really not on board with it. But yeah, that's I feel like that goes without saying. When he's talking about Russians, he's not talking about the Russian citizens or even just, Russians around the world. No, he's talking about literally the government. Because that's the only people those are only people, and also the rich people that, the oligarchs or whatever, are the only people that are actually for this at this point, right?
Which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are going to try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. this isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone, and it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that they believed was an arm of the American empire?
A history YouTube channel voicing an opinion. Wrong
The
way
rule
now.
of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as, just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right to control.
And they always have, like, if you look at like a historic map of Russia, they usually did go to war and take over and invade all of these countries, including Ukraine. They always would keep these countries under their thumb because they know that they're smaller, you know. So yeah, it's kind of just how the geopolitical game works.
Their goals in Europe simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now? It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open.
That's true. Like, NATO has done bad things, but in this regard, this is nothing. They haven't done anything bad. Like, in all honesty, compared to this.
It's been
You
said
know.
that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence. Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh. Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy's side. Keep them sanctioned for decades.
Yep. And literally, it was super funny because they tried to kill Castro so much, but it never worked. So it's like, we know what happened. It's just that it just didn't really affect America that much. Except for
Which,
sanctions.
here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done. And it's true the United States has done a lot of bad...
I mean, but yeah, you can. I mean, the U.S. has done bad things, but you can also say Russia has done bad. More like, we'll say Russia has probably done more. They're just not going to say because they don't want to. They're not going to let the people know that. So you can't really. I feel like you can't even really use that argument that the U.S. is worse. Like, they're probably just as bad. You know what I mean? So, I don't know. And the funny thing is, I wouldn't even call myself a patriot for America. So, you're hearing this from somebody that's not even a patriot and that knows that, yeah, that's probably not the best thing.
bad things. Iraq, for instance, that was bad. It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war without disappearing. The closest the US had to censor...
Yeah. It's funny that, you can protest without actually people disappearing from the protest and you don't hear
During
about them
opposition to the Iraq war was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell? Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia?
I feel like no, because they would have already felt a nationalistic paranoia as they seen the U.S. and and also like Britain and like other European countries, like even Germany, doing amazingly well for themselves. I feel like they would have felt more isolated because it would have been a different group. It just would have been called a different group because obviously Ukraine and all the other countries, they would have wanted to make a group to keep them protected. You know what I mean? So yeah, it wouldn't have changed anything. It just would have been that.
In its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country. Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like.
Yeah, I think so.
The Russians believed, in part because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany, that with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. That instead there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special privileges. While to the Americans, they took the fall of the USSR as a victory.
Yeah, because for them, it basically was a victory. Like, because they're like, yeah, your ideology didn't last, and it couldn't last.
Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic prosperity of the West. It was a complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in. Yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recent events, didn't actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders. The main issue the Russian government has isn't just a military bloc, but Western institutions. Or at least institutions that don't serve their interests. If Putin wasn't blaming NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from all perspectives, yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions.
It really doesn't.
Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months. NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact collapsed. And when that didn't happen, they claimed no fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all is coming down to a real war within a split nation. A war that, while true has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore. One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless of the justification, only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah, congrats Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to build up. While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
That is quite literally insane. It's less than $1. Because it's less, wow. That is insane how low their money went down. The inflation there is actually insane, though. Oof. Yeah, I'll definitely put the link in the description for in the description of my video too, in case you didn't feel like going to the actual video to go, you know, in case you didn't feel like watching the video again, or you know, like going to link in the description for the original video. I'll put the original video and the link for fundraising in there too. So talk to you guys in the next video, and yeah, peace.